What is going on, gunfighters? Saddle up for another episode of Gunfighter Life, the podcast where we talk about gunfighting the right way, with God at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. First and foremost, I am a Christian, a servant of God, and a follower of Jesus Christ. God has blessed me to do many things in my life where I could do nothing apart from Him. U.S. Marine Corps combat veteran, did a couple of tours in Iraq. As an assaultman after my combat tours, I was an urban warfare instructor for the Marine Corps under Mojave Viper. Also served in the U.S. Army, both full-time and part-time National Guard. Also did several years in law enforcement, LAPD. I worked regular assignments and more specialized assignments. Been a private contractor for a 3-letter government agency. That's all I'll say about that. Been blessed to be a state rifle and pistol champion. And West Coast Regional Rifle Champion. Won more shooting competitions with the talent that God's given me than I can actually remember. Was blessed to be the commander of a tactical team in a large metropolitan area. Our primary job, the reason we primarily existed, was to stop active shooters. I got the opportunity to head up and be the commander of that team. I grew up around guns, hunting and shooting and competing at a very early age. Been blessed to hunt all over this beautiful country, from whitetail on the East Coast to mule deer on the West Coast, and bear and elk and all manner of things. I've even been a professional big game hunter and guide. But again, most importantly, I'm a Christian. And I am your host, Michael Melito. Welcome to Gunfighter Life. So this is try number 3 on the 350 Remington Magnum. First time I was doing a mobile episode and the wife called, which dropped the podcast. And the second time, for whatever reason, I recorded the whole thing, thought it was good, and went to listen to it, and it was blank. Like, literally none of it recorded. I have no idea why it said it was recording. Anyway, just life, I guess. But the good thing for you guys is, the good news is that this won't be from the mobile studio. This will be from the semi-mobile studio. So we're moving up. Actually going to be stationary, hopefully, by God's grace, for more than a couple of days. If you care about the doings of myself, the host, I will be in Florida for the winter. My wife talked me into it so she could spend time with her family, her niece and nephew. They're at that age where they're starting to be able to play and have fun and things like that, and she wants to spend time with them, and I love my wife, so here I am. I must admit that for December, wearing short sleeves is pretty nice. Perhaps I'll even get to kill some things while I'm here. Anyway, with that, let's talk about the 350 Remington Magnum, which I have independently titled the Dixieland Dragoon. The more I researched this cartridge, the more I really kind of like it. I got to admit, the more I checked into it and looked at the numbers and the rifles it's chambered in, I really, really like this cartridge. The 350 Remington Magnum. So talking about this cartridge, I think it's only fair to compare it to kind of the Breyer's vanilla of short-action rifle cartridges, or the standard white F-150 of rifle cartridges. And I'm going to call that the 308 Winchester, 150 grain. And to use good round numbers, your numbers may vary depending on barrel length and the temperature outside and how high you are above sea level and a bunch of other stuff. But a good, easy way to remember it is 150 at 2800. I know there's probably hotter loads out there, but for good round numbers, 150 grain bullet at 2800 feet a second is a good rule of thumb for the 308 Winchester. So let's just, for the sake of argument, if we can, use those numbers. And let's look a little bit at the 350 Remington Magnum. The 350 Remington Magnum, and I should say I'm quoting from, thanks to one of the patrons, Cartridges of the World. You're looking at a 200 grain bullet at 2700. Again, that's 200 versus 150. You got a 300 at 2350 and a 300 at 2300. So looking at that data, those look to be reloads, and for factory ammo, you're looking at a 200 at 3000. This I'm quoting from Wikipedia, and a 250 at 2500. Those are impressive numbers. Those numbers are nothing to turn your nose up at. If you consider those compared to a 308, and a 308 is touted as being a great all-around cartridge, and it is. It's the biggest hunting cartridge that I own, and I've hunted all over North America. Those are impressive numbers for the 350 Remington Magnum. And if you don't know, these are designed to fit in short, handy carbines. They're a short action length, which means anything, pretty much any action that'll chamber 308 and its offspring, the 7mm Aud 8, the 243, should be able to handle just fine the 350 Remington Magnum. And that's pretty cool. One of the patrons who I love and respect, and we have a lot of back and forth, we disagree on some things. He took some exception to the fact that this was called a Magnum cartridge. And I asked why, just to be curious, because I thought about it for a few days and then asked him why. And he said, well, compared to the 35 Whelen, it's really not any more powerful. And I would totally agree with that. I think the 35 Whelen is a better all-around big game hunting cartridge for North America. However, the 35 Whelen is a 30-06 offspring, and it's really made to be in a full-size rifle. So if you're going to hunt elk out west with a full-size rifle or moose, yeah, the 35 Whelen is a great cartridge. But that's not really the philosophy. That's not really the idea behind the 350 Remington Magnum. It was designed to be fired in short, handy carbines, whereas the 35 Whelen you might find in a full-length, full-size Remington 700, Savage 110. The 350 Remington Magnum was tailor-made for something like the Remington 600, the 660, and later the 673. These are really cool guns. I did a whole episode on the Remington Model 7 and the 600, 660 Mohawk kind of series. You might want to go back and listen to that. A really cool gun. And I didn't know until researching this, they re-released it and came out with the 673 guide gun, which looks strikingly like the old Mohawk. Cool, handy little woods carbines. And I know that today it's very in vogue to want these super high, super long range BC bullets to be chambered in your 20-pound PRC rifle to shoot off a sandbag. But let's be honest, for most hunters, and I recently went east of the Mississippi again, and I didn't go hunting, but I went out with my buddy in the woods and talked with a couple of people that hunted, and that's where I hail from, where I grew up, in that kind of environment. Now, unless you have private land and private fields to hunt on, the public land is few and far between, and when it is, it's usually swamp and real thick forest. And that's what a lot of people are dealing with that live east of the Mississippi, unless they're wealthy or are well connected and can hunt that private land in those private fields. But if you're talking about a thick, dense woods carbine for, let's say where I'm at right now, right? The jungles of Florida, or the Pacific Northwest, where I came from and spent the entire summer on the coast of Oregon, right? Real thick, dense stuff. You're talking about the cypress swamps of Virginia, that public land where you might come across some of those big bucks. In the southern forest, all that brush and greenbrier and young pine, where you're probably never going to see a deer over 200 yards that you can legally shoot at. For a thick, dense, I'm going to call it a woods carbine, a Dixieland Dragoon, a heavy-hitting, light, handy, short, easy to maneuver in thick brush and undergrowth in the second canopy and things like that. It's a great cartridge. I think it's really underrated. I think that this cartridge, unlike a lot of other cartridges that kind of flop, this one got a second chance. This one got introduced in the 1960s, and then they brought it back again in 2002 per this manual in the 673, which looks like a gorgeous rifle. And gun culture and what's in vogue is kind of funny. Maybe it came out at the wrong time. Maybe Remington, as it does with a lot of as it has done with a few of its other cartridges that I'm aware of, just maybe did a really bad job of marketing it. But the 350 Remington Magnum is a beastie little cartridge for a light, handy carbine. Again, for a full-size rifle, I think there's better choices. But if you're talking about hunting inside 200 yards with a light, handy woods carbine, putting it in a canoe, hunting, let's say, the Green Mountains of Vermont or the cypress swamps of Virginia or the, whatever you call it here, the palmetto jungles of Florida, and you want a heavy-hitting carbine, something that I'm not much on sitting down and just sitting in a stand or a blind and hunting. I like to spot and stalk and still hunt. For that thing where you may get a shot at varying angles. It may not even need to be for a big moose or something. This cartridge would certainly take moose with proper bullet construction. Perhaps something like a monolithic or something like that. It would certainly take moose because a 308 will certainly take moose. And we looked at the numbers, right? If you're spot and stalk or still hunting, you may not be able to wait for that perfect broadside shot. You may get them quartering away from you or looking back over their shoulder or real calm and staring right at you because you're both standing in the same, access road, logging road, or one little clearing. And it's that shot or no shot. A cartridge like this in a light handy woods carbine would be awesome. It'd also be a great choice for all but giant, Alaskan coastal brown bears. And there'd be worse choices than this, but it would certainly be a good choice for even the biggest black bear. I've never hunted in Maine, but I did live in New Hampshire, so I am familiar, and I definitely went to Maine. That kind of environment where you got moose and you got bear and you got big deer. New Hampshire, Vermont, those kind of places. Really anywhere east of the Mississippi, I think a light, handy little woods carbine. Now, if you're sitting on a stand, if you hunt in a blind, I'm not putting that down. However you want to put meat on the table. You want to put a giant pile of sweet corn out and sit it exactly 100 yards away in your heated blind and put meat on the table that way, still probably better than watching Netflix, right? I'm not putting that down. That's just not how I hunt. If you're going to hunt like that, it doesn't really matter for that. But if you're talking about, getting your boots muddy or, climbing some elevation, crawling under underbrush, trying to quietly navigate your way through greenbrier patches, a short, handy little rifle like this would be an awesome choice. If you ever look at, and I don't want to get too deep down the rabbit hole of these rifles, because this was chambered in other rifles too, but mainly I think the 600, 660, and the 673, they're just awesome little choices, and I think this would be an awesome choice in that rifle. I think they were on the right track when they introduced this, and I don't know if it just wasn't in vogue either time or they marketed it wrong. I mean, Remington's kind of notorious for that with their 280 Remington, which is perhaps one of the most well-balanced North American big game cartridges, period, end of sentence, or the 6mm Remington, which is on paper better than the 243. They just put the wrong twist rate in it and I think marketed it wrong. Anyway, they're kind of notorious for that. Maybe that's what happened here. I don't know. I wasn't around in 1965 when this thing first came out, and I don't really remember it at all when I was big into shooting in the early 2000s. Yeah, they say they reintroduced it in 2002. Now, granted, I was in the Marine Corps overseas fighting a war, so maybe that's why I don't remember that. But looking back at it, it sure looks like a great, great option. Not just east of the Mississippi, but especially east of the Mississippi. If you're talking about public land, dense forest hunting, the Appalachians, anywhere like that, anywhere that you're not going to get a shot over 200 yards. Not that this won't kill past 200 yards, it certainly will, it's just not the most efficient past that. But if that's how you hunt, it would be a great choice. And I think it certainly is a Magnum when compared to the 308. And I think what you would compare this to is, and the patron, I disagree with him, and that's fine. You should not agree with everything that I say, right? I'm not infallible. I'm a human being. I am wrong all the time. I screw up all the time. We can have differing opinions. I totally respect his. And hopefully you totally respect mine and see where I'm coming from. But I think you can consider this a Magnum. One, I think the parent case is the 7mm Remington Magnum. And two, we got to look at what do you compare it to. Like the 22 Magnum is not a powerful cartridge, but when you compare it to the 22 long rifle, yeah, it's a Magnum. The 222 Remington Magnum is not a powerful cartridge, but when you compare it to the 222 it is, or the 22 Hornet, which were common at the time. If you compare this to the other 35 calibers and short handy woods carbines, I think you kind of can consider it a Magnum. If you compare it to, let's say, the 35 Remington, great cartridge. Originally, I believe, for the Remington Model 8 semi-auto, and then a bunch of other things, but probably most famously in the Marlin 336, awesome cartridge. If you compare that as a kind of the de facto short handy woods carbine, I think the 35, or as I was, the 350 Remington Magnum, definitely could be called a Magnum compared to that. And we have to consider what I would call probably the ubiquitous, the kind of quintessential handy woods carbine, or just handy carbine, the Winchester 94 30-30. To a lesser extent, the Marlin 336, but the Winchester 94 30-30, when you say quick handy carbine, that's probably what comes to mind, unless somebody's thinking of an AR. But when you're talking about hunting, they generally think of that. And it's a fantastic gun. They're chambered in other things, but the vast, vast majority are chambered in 30-30. And when you look at this compared to a 30-30, I think, yeah, it's a Magnum. And we have to remember that Magnum is mostly just marketing hype. Like the 28 Nosler, I believe, is more powerful than the 7mm Remington Magnum. But just, I think people weren't infatuated with Magnums when they introduced that, and they were kind of turned off by the term Magnum. So they just called it the 28 Nosler, even though it's more powerful than the 7 Rem Mag. But the 7 Rem Mag is certainly more powerful than the 7x57 Mauser, which was probably the most common 7mm when it came out. And it's a marketing term. If you don't know where that comes from, as I understand the history, and I could be wrong, back in the day, champagne bottles. They had your standard size champagne bottle, and then they had the big champagne bottle. And it was called a Magnum. I think people were probably familiar with the term, so when they came out with a big, beefy hunting cartridge, they called it a Magnum, and it kind of took off. Now we probably associate the term Magnum more with rifle cartridges than with champagne bottles. But just realize that it's a marketing term, right? And Magnum is in the eye of the beholder. Now, as much as I like the Winchester 94 30-30, a quick, handy little woods carbine, from what I can remember of that Mohawk, I think it was years since I've handled one. But if you offered me that in 30-30, or that rifle, or the 673, which is a beautiful rifle, I gotta say. Sometimes when I do these episodes, I'm like, oh man, now I want that rifle. But I don't really need it. But if you said you could take that classic 30-30, which would be a great choice, or you could take a Mohawk in 350 Remington Magnum to hunt Maine for moose, or to hunt in Dixie in the cypress swamps, or in the rolling hills of Georgia, or the palmetto jungles of the deeper south, the Mississippi Delta. All day long, I would take that Mohawk or that 673 and 350 Remington Magnum. I think it's a fantastic choice. If you said I was going out west, or I had to pick just one rifle and I had to choose this or the 35 Whelen, I'd pick the 35 Whelen. I do like to hunt out west, and I think for a western cartridge, the 35 Whelen certainly gets it. And if you're hunting from a stand or don't plan on walking that far, and you're hunting in a more open area, the 35 Whelen's probably a better all-around cartridge. But if you're talking about a quick, handy carbine, I think the 35 Remington has a place. And it's sad that it got a second chance, and it still, I think, was not appreciated. I did look yesterday when I initially first recorded this episode, or maybe the second time I recorded this episode. Anyway, I looked last night, and there is factory ammunition available. However, I think be better served if you were going to get this cartridge if you reload it, and it will give you a lot more flexibility. I saw some classic Remington core locks, which are a fine field-proven round, right? They've been putting animals in the dirt for a long time. So there's that option. I saw another smaller boutique manufacturer, I can't remember, that made 350 Remington Magnum. But I think, and this is probably level 2.0 of reloading, but reforming cases is not super hard. I don't know how hard it would be to form and reneck a case from the 7mm Rem Mag, but if that's the parent case, you should be able to make them from that, and that's certainly a super common round and a way to get brass. And once you have the brass formed, I have a hard time believing that most people would shoot 350 Rem Mag enough to have to keep replacing cases, especially if you don't go to the very crazy high end of the spectrum. Anyway, I think it'd be a great cartridge. I think it'd be a fun one to reload. 35 caliber bullets are not, uncommon. They're not scarce. There's a lot of really good options. Anything from the monolithics to it'd be really cool to look at what's available in the 250 to 300 grain, bonded bullets if they make like a partition or an A-frame or Sirocco. That'd be pretty cool. There'd certainly be better choices for really big coastal brown bears in Alaska, but there'd certainly be far worse choices. And with proper bullet construction, a 300 grain bullet of good construction, Nosler partition or a Swift A-frame or a Sirocco or something like that, there are certainly far worse choices. A really cool cartridge chambered for really cool rifles. It does kind of sadden me. Perhaps one day, if I see one for a good amount of money at a gun show that's been beat up, because let's be real, I'm going to beat it up, so I don't want a collector gun. I want a gun to hunt with. It would be a cool add-on to the collection. Maybe I'd get it in this caliber. Maybe I'd just get it in 308, one of those little handy carbines. But I think a really underappreciated cartridge. If you like this, you want to support the podcast, I hope you'll consider becoming a patron. There should be a link in the show notes. I am truly humbled that you give me some of your time, and I am truly humbled and blessed by all the men that step up and support this podcast. With that, the tactical tip of the day. This one is from one of the patrons talking about Patreon, and I can't believe I never thought of this or didn't realize this, but he was saying for a lot of standard choke tubes, I assume 12 gauge or 20 gauge, you can use the rim of a cartridge. Now make sure you don't hit the primer, but should be no issue using the rim of a cartridge. It's not, there's no priming compound in the rim, but you can use a rim of a shotgun shell to loosen up a choke if you have to, or tighten a choke if you have to. And he pointed out, and I've certainly had this experience, if you do quite a bit of shooting, those choke tubes can work loose. So checking them, and if they're a little bit loose, just grabbing a shell and tightening it, that's a really cool tactical tip. So thanks to the patron that mentioned that. The tactical verse of the day, Genesis 25. Then Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. And that reminds me of a verse I read this morning. Jesus, he came that we may have life and have it more abundantly. A full, abundant life. Now, Jesus also says the abundance of a man's life does not consist in the things that he possesses. But Jesus came that we may have life and have it more abundant. When you walk with God, when you're a righteous man like Abraham, when you walk with God, when you seek God, when you find God, it is an abundant life. Let's try and be circumspect, men, and keep our eye on what's really important, the important things of life. With that, thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.